Hey everyone, so this represents our last set of notes for our protists before we jump into fungi. But this is just an important group to look at because we have our connection between kingdom Plantae and kingdom Protista, right? So looking here, this group of multicellular algae, we would group into protists simply because they lack tissues and organ systems like true roots that kingdom Plantae would have. So although they're multicellular, they don't have that specialization of tissues and organ systems that plants have, and therefore not in kingdom Plantae. But they represent the evolutionary link, right, between single-celled and multicellular. And we'll start to see towards the end of this the evolution of sexual reproduction, which is evident in multicellular organisms. All right, so to start with, we're just going to look at some groups of multicellular algae and just give some characteristics of these main groups. So the first group is what we call colonial algae. And so the example that I would give here, or the example in this picture over here, and again, I'm going to do the best with my pen, and I may stop at times and just type in on the monitor. But our first group and the individual shown here is called a volvox, and I'm going to have problems with my pen already. A volvox, so that's V-O-L-V-O-X. And that's the group shown here at the side. And okay, I'm resorting to typing, so I apologize for the pounding away on the keyboard here. But so these are referred to as colonial. So what you've got is groups of cells working in a coordinated manner. All right, and so what that means is that some cells tend to be more efficient at specific roles, right? Specific roles or functions. And so we might say that they're specialized. So, for example, things like maybe movement or feeding and even reproduction. All right, so you've got specialization occurring in some of these cells that make up the organ. Okay, our next group here, shown off to the right over here, this group is our filamentous, so kind of like filaments, right? Little tiny straws in a sense. And that's shown over here. These are filamentous algae, and the representative I've shown in this particular picture is called Spirogyra. All right, so Spirogyra. And these guys, if I'm going to pause the video and I'm going to blow up the picture here a little bit. Okay, so if you look carefully in the bigger, or in this picture here, it's a little bit hard to distinguish individual cells, but if we look closely here, and you can see the cell wall forming in between, so you've got one cell shown right here in the middle, this guy that goes from about here to here. And what's interesting with this group is they have a spiral band of chloroplasts, so that's their name, Spirogyra. But these are chloroplasts in a spiral band there. All right. Okay, sorry, I thought I'd pause my monitor, but it didn't pause. So I typed out there Spirogyra, and so they are characterized by a slender, rod-shaped thallus, right? So basically their structure, right? This multicellular structure that is a rod-shaped thallus, or I guess you could say filament, all right? Rows cells joined together. And again, certain cells showing specialization. In particular, with anchoring the thallus or filament to some substrate. So that substrate being like a rock or sediment, right? So we wouldn't call it a true root like a plant because it doesn't actually absorb water like a root does, right? Roots are designed to absorb water and deliver that water to the plant. This is just acting as a structural component to kind of anchor the plant um, within whatever medium that it's growing. So finally, our last group here, just sort of going through the main groups, is this picture shown off to the right over here, which is a multicellular algae by the name of ulva, which is essentially a type of sea lettuce. All right, and so it has a large, complex thallus. All right, so in this case, the thallus isn't filamentous or like sort of these long fibers. It's literally a large, broad, leafy thallus, right? As you see in the picture. So what's interesting about this is it's quite large. Like so, most of these that we're looking at here up above are microscopic, and you could likely only see them with a microscope, or maybe a mass like what you see in this picture here. You might see with your own eye, but it would be very difficult. Whereas this thing could be several centimeters across. So this thallus could be up to several centimeters across, but it's only 2 cell layers thick, kind of like that Elodia that you were looking at before, right? So very, very paper thin in its structure, only 2 cell layers thick. But what is important about this group that we're going to look at towards the end of this is so here we will observe what is called, so we're going to observe the reproductive cycle of this algae, which is referred to as alternation of generations. And I won't get into the detail here, but it's kind of the evolution of sexual reproduction. All right. Okay, so this top half that we've just gone over just kind of represents some of the general characteristics of all multicellular algae that you might come across. And so now we're just going to look at 3 distinct groups, right? We call them the phyla. So if we think about, classification, right? We're talking about the phylum. So we're in kingdom Protista, right? Domain Euchara, kingdom Protista, and we're going to just talk about 3 simple phylum. The first one being Chlorophyta, and chloro coming from green, right? Chlorophyll, and again, phyta. We want to kind of remember that phyta, referring to plant, right? So these guys, Chlorophyta, their phylum name literally means green plant, right? Green plant. And that's, pretty much all these, the ones that I showed as examples up here, are various types of Chlorophyta And so again, in any one phylum, you can see colonial, filamentous, or multicellular algae like the ova, right? But these ones specifically are chlorophyta, and that's because they contain the pigments chlorophyll A and B. So these are just two different types of chlorophyll, all right? And so, as I said, they range from colonial, filamentous, and sheet or leaf-like, as above, right? They are mainly aquatic, so you're going to find them in most aquatic environments, mainly aquatic, but some terrestrial, okay? But the terrestrial environment obviously has to be very moist, right? They store their food as starch, like most plants. And hence, when we think of the plants on land being mostly green plants and storing their energy as starch, these are the evolutionary ancestors to our land plants, right? And I hope I'm going to fit this on here. I'm going to go back and just pause this and just move things around so it fits on the same page. So this group in particular forms many symbiotic relationships with other species and other completely different organisms, such as animal invertebrates and fungi. And the example with fungi is lichen, which we'll get into when we talk about lichen and fungi in the next chapter. Okay, so that's our first group, phylum Chlorophyta. All right. Our next group is phylum Phaeophyta. So Phaeophyta comes from a name that represents commonly called brown algae. And again, a lot of these colors are coming from their photosynthetic pigments. So these ones have both chlorophyll A and C, so slightly different. And they also contain and also what is called fucoxanthin, which is another photosynthetic pigment different from chlorophyll. Common groups here include sargassum and large kelps. If you've ever been out on the ocean, you see those large kelps. They have the bull kelp with the big bulb that kind of floats up on the surface. Or if you've been on, especially down near the equator, more tropical places, and you see those just massive beaches just littered with the seaweed, the brown seaweed, which is sargassum. So very common in warmer climates. Up around here, our coast, Pacific coast of BC and such, you'll find those large kelps, those bull kelps, as an example. And they can be up to like 45 meters in length, right? Those large kelps. Yeah, some interesting facts about this group that they're so they store food differently. So food storage is in the form of lamarin, which is, or sorry, I should say lamin. I got to spell this right. Laminarin, which is basically stored glucose, but different bonds than starch, right? So basically stored sugar, but in a slightly different way than starch. And these guys have lots of commercial significance, at least in our world. And that is they produce a compound called algae or alginic acid, of which we derive alginate, which is used in cosmetics, drugs, the production of various types of drugs, as food, etc. Even I think like in the production of food, so I should say as in production of food and as a food source. All right, next group. So this is phylum Rhodophyta. Phylum Rhodophyta. This is a group known as red algae. All right, and here they have chlorophyll A and as well some other photosynthetic pigments called phycobilins. And this allows them to absorb light at greater depths. We can talk about that in class. I'll go over it in more detail, but essentially, if we think about competition and natural selection has caused the evolution of a variety of different algae that can live at different depths based on the photosynthetic pigments that they have. And this avoids competition, right, for food, nutrients, space, etc. And so by living at a different depth, they're going to require a different photosynthetic pigment because not all light can penetrate through deeper levels of water, right? So they can be found at as deep as like 200 meters or so. They're mainly marine, right? So saltwater, but also some freshwater and land or terrestrial groups. Okay, and they have cell walls slightly different than the others. Cell walls are coated with a sticky substance called carrageenan, which you might be familiar with on the ingredients labels in ice cream and a variety of other stuff. But it is a gelatinous kind of compound and also used in cosmetics, in making gel capsules. So when you think of like drug manufacturers and your Advil and Tylenol capsules, that same sticky gel-like material is made in using those, even some cheeses. And also agar is an abstract, or extracted, I should say, sorry, is extracted from this group. And we'll see that in our lab on Friday, extracted from this group, and an excellent food source for bacteria. Yeah, so that's it. This is what I want to talk about in terms of reproduction in algae and this idea of the alternation of generations. So what I want you to see here is we're going to go over this and we're going to see more of it when we talk about fungus. But ultimately, you've got two different plants here that give rise to reproductive cells. So if you remember back right at the start, we were talking about how in these colonial, you've got certain cells specialized for reproduction. So now we start to see in this evolution of multicellular organisms that some of these cells within the leaf of the plant are specialized in reproduction, and they're producing reproductive cells, which we refer to as gametes, just like our sperm and egg. And so if you have one plant, it might be considered a male plant producing a reproductive cell, and another one, a female plant, producing a reproductive cell that might be slightly different. The fertilization of those two means that you're now joining genetic information. And so this is a sense of sexual reproduction. But what we want to talk about is that this plant, this multicellular algae, I should say, kind of goes through alternate periods of being haploid and diploid in its life cycle. And we'll talk about that more next week. And I'll review some of the, well, let's do this quickly. So some of the ecological roles, well, of course, many of them are photosynthesizers. They all are. So therefore, producing oxygen for atmosphere, and as such, also major impacts on carbon and water cycles, right? In the process, right, of taking in carbon dioxide, making sugars, right, requiring water for photosynthesis, they have a major influence on that, and then producing oxygen as a byproduct for just about every other living animal on the planet, right? Many provide habitats, so shelter. So if you think of kelp forests, these are a major marine ecosystem, super important for lots of different organisms, and then of course food for many aquatic life. And then separate, maybe not so much as an ecological role, but don't forget commercial use for us. All right, that's it. Have a good rest of your weekend.